Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to wait to let everybody come in and queue into the room. While we're doing that, as I said, welcome. I have Sasha DeWind from Tutor Associates with me. I'm Barry Norman from Expert Admissions, and we're here to reflect on this year's early cycle, the fall of 2023. And also to look ahead. As you know, in college admissions, there's never a dull moment. We've got things to report that have kind of been impacted by things that happened last spring that are new to this cycle. And we have new things coming up both on the admissions and testing side. So thank you for joining us. We're going to start we want to get a sense of who we have with us. And so in a couple of moments, I'm going to put up a poll and just ask you to share what grade level your student is in so that we can tailor our responses to who is in the audience. We talk about things a little bit differently depending if the audience is skewing older or younger. So let us know. And if you have any questions, please use the Q&A tab. We're going to keep an eye on those questions as we go. So many registrants were wonderful in submitting questions to us in advance. We've reviewed those questions and have tailored what we're talking about based on the questions and information you asked for in those responses. So we hope that it will be helpful to everybody, but if there's something we're not speaking of or if you need clarification, please feel free to ask us in the Q&A section. So it looks like we have about 53% 11th graders, 21% 10th graders, and 11% 12th graders. And then we've got some 9th grade and others accounting for the remaining approximately 16%. It's moving a little bit as I speak, but we've got almost half 11th graders, and then our next biggest contingent is 10th graders, not surprisingly. So thank you, and we will take that into account as we speak. And I am going to pop it over to Sasha.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm looking forward to hopefully demystifying all things ACT, SAT, and certainly academic as well. We got so many questions about the new SAT and about the ACT versus the SAT. So I thought I would start with sort of an overview of those two admissions tests, give some sort of advice about what kinds of students might take the SAT versus the ACT this year and in coming years, and then move into some details about how to prepare for those exams and how to maybe conceptualize and think about how to really master those tests. So, in the big picture, and I always say this, these are comparable exams, right? These are standardized tests, the SAT and the ACT, and they both test, broadly speaking, grammar and reading and math. The ACT does have a separate section called the science section, which I'll go into in a little more detail, but it really is just reading comprehension of scientific passages. I make it sound easy. It's not easy, but it is not really content-based. It's really about reading comprehension. And so in a sort of general sort of way, these tests are comparable, and a child should pick one, not both. There's not extra points for trying them both. It's just double the work. And they should pick one, and they should really pick the one that suits them better. We always recommend a full length diagnostic in each before we get started. The kids have sometimes already taken those by the time they get to me. And those diagnostics, and then not just the scores, but the digging into the diagnostics, help us really understand which test is right for a child. And so, sometimes the scores are very comparable, right? They're on different scales. The SAT is out of 1600. Like in our day, it's changed and gone back and forth, but the best possible score is a 1600 with an 800 on the reading and verbal and 800 on the math. And the ACT is out of 36. Of course, why make it simple? It's out of 36, and they'll give you a number out of 36 on the grammar, which is called the English, the reading, the math, and the science, and then they'll give you a composite and average. But you can kind of line up these scores and, kind of see if they're comparable. And sometimes when your child takes diagnostics, it's very easy to tell which test they should take. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes those scores are comparable, or it's higher on one side on one test and higher on the other test. And that's when you really dig in. The why behind the scores is important. And we're going to talk about why a child might be struggling on one of these tests when they are often very strong students. But the diagnostics are really the starting point for any child who's thinking about choosing the test. And this year, of course, we have to shake things up for those juniors. And certainly those sophomores need to be thinking about this as well. But as of March of this year, so the next time you can take the SAT is in March, and it's brand new. I've been talking about this for over a year now, but it's here. We're here. And the SAT has done a lot to try to make itself, I think, more appealing to kids. And I'm sure it will work to some extent. It's shorter. It's only about 2 hours instead of over 3 hours. And it's online. So you download an app and then you can take it on your laptop. You're still going to a testing center or taking it at school. This is not an at-home test, but it's online. And they've made the reading passages shorter. They've done a number of things to, I think, make it more appealing, at least at first sight, to kids and they've given kids enough time to take it, which I think is great, right? They don't put a lot of time pressure on kids within each section. It's also, because it's online, they've also gone a step further. They've made it this digital test adaptable, or adaptive, I should say. I wish it were adaptable. It's adaptive, which means that how you perform on your first module or section on the verbal will determine the next module you'll get. And the same thing goes on the math. So the way that your score works is obviously it's about the number of questions you get right, but it's about also how well you perform on harder questions. And so there's an algorithm, right, that allows you to account for not just the number right, which is how it used to be, but the number right on a certain level of difficulty. There's lots of built-in features to this app. There's a built-in calculator, though you can bring your own. There's built-in sort of reading annotation tools, a built-in clock. So lots of little nifty things to make it sort of easier as you're testing on a laptop. And you can bring scrap paper and a pencil. So if you want to work things out, you can. You don't need to be doing it all on the screen. And so some kids already are starting to prepare for this new SAT. And certainly it's one viable option for our current juniors, though they're the guinea pigs here, the newbies. We've been here before, but we're here again. And certainly for sophomores looking ahead, or our ninth graders looking ahead, the new SAT, the digital SAT, the adaptive SAT is something that is worth consideration. And, we'll get into this in more detail, but when you're picking a test, certainly it's about your performance on those tests and your feeling while you take them and the why behind those scores. It's also about the timing. When are these tests being offered? When are you busy? Some kids have spring sports or their summers are completely booked, and these tests are in different dates. And so that's something to think about. And then, of course, as you're preparing for the new SAT, one very important thing that our 11th graders are taking into consideration is the materials available. There are materials available, and we certainly have a discount in partnership with Test Innovators, who has done some amazing work creating adaptive SAT practice. But you really want that College Board practice from the SAT themselves. And there's only 4 of those available right now, and they'll release more over time, but certainly materials are more limited than they would be in a normal year. And then they will be in the future, and they're more limited than they are on the ACT. So that's the SAT. It's new, but of course, we'll have a similar flavor to the old SAT. And I've always thought of the SAT as sort of I don't know if my kids would agree with me, my students, but it's like the fun, bumpy road. It's a little tricky. I think the answer choices are a little tricky. And certainly adapting to an adaptive test that's online is a new thing for our kids. And those who will take it will do lots of practice in that sort of scenario, in that context, so that they feel comfortable. And the ACT is same as it's always been. They did a little pilot online thing, but they're doing nothing differently this year, which I am always a fan of. The ACT is on paper and it's not adaptive. And it's the same as it's been for as long as I've known about it, 20 years that I've been doing this almost. And so certainly students who like predictability, I'm one of those students, but not everyone is, will really like that about the ACT. And the ACT is not perfect either. It's a longer test that takes stamina. And if you have special accommodations, which we're going to talk about as well, it takes even more stamina. And nobody likes that pesky science section at the end. It's hard, and it's the last section on the test, and certainly takes some getting used to. The ACT math covers more topics on the sort of that, than the SAT math. So there's more breadth as well as depth on that ACT math. And most of all, the ACT does not like to give kids enough time to complete the work that's given to them. So you really find that children come out of that diagnostic and they go, I just didn't finish. I just didn't finish. And I always warn parents and kids, this is very normal. And indeed, a good tutor will take whichever test your child's working with and break it down into the patterns that make that test difficult, and then give your child procedures to work with what they have. So yes, the ACT doesn't give you enough time. What do you do about that? How do you maneuver through it so that you still have enough raw score points to nail that score? So whichever test you take, there is a path. I want to be clear about that. And preparation should really be about making sure your child has all the content. Sure, they have to know how to match a subject and a verb. They have to know where a comma goes. They have to know their coordinate geometry. But really, so much of the work you do in preparing for these tests is about preparing to understand the patterns deeply. And the tutors at Tutor Associates, and certainly other tutors, they know these tests, they know the patterns, and every single pattern has a procedure. Every time I see a verb, I do this. Every time I see a main idea question, or every time I see a question with a variable in the answer choice, there are certain procedures children can do that allows them to navigate the test with more ease and to minimize mistakes. And then I also think an under sort of prioritized part of preparation for these exams is the sort of performance element. Your children are taking these tests under pressure. They're feeling a lot of pressure. They're often very nervous while they're testing, and certainly under time pressure. Some of them are distracted. Some of them are tired. Some of them are bored, understandably. And, we certainly work with children to expect those feelings and those thoughts and those experiences. And then we try to provide concrete strategies and to manage them, whether it be changing the way that we're eating before and during tests. I'm a big fan of those chocolate covered espresso beans for our tired students, or no chocolate covered espresso beans if we're anxious and we're jittery, but also going through some of those performance related feelings and thoughts so that we can mitigate them during game day. So those are the two tests available. I know we had questions about when to start. I think it's never too early to diagnose. I mean, a little bit too early. It could be a little too early, but most kids are taking diagnostics sort of sometime at the end of 10th grade. And that could be in spring, and their schools give them diagnostics. It could be in June, right after 10th grade. It could be over the summer before. We certainly have 11th graders coming to us now who, for whatever reason, haven't done this yet and are doing it now. And, Barry will talk about this more too, but there's no date you have to take these tests. You have to be done by really sort of the fall of your senior year, November-ish for early decision, certainly January 1st for everyone else, but there's no race to get there first. And I know there's pressure. So many juniors tell me, my friend's already done. Well, your friend maybe had a really, open summer, or your friend, is done, but is not, doing great in algebra 2 trig or in pre-calc. And the grades come first and the mental health comes first. And then, we have some time to work on these tests. So I would say diagnosing, sort of taking those diagnostics in 10th grade and in sort of before 11th grade is great, because then we can say, let's get going, get it out of the way. We can say, let's wait. We can say, let's start later. And I know Barry's heard me say this a million times, but I always think, once you get going, it's like learning a foreign language. You got to start and you got to work intensely until you're ready to be done. The stopping and starting doesn't work as well. It ends up being sort of a waste of resources, time, and certainly money. So we like kids to do that. And we're a fan of testing when a child's ready. Not every kid's ready at the same time. Some kids are still finishing up Algebra 2 trig as juniors. Some are ahead of that. Some have fall sports, some have spring sports. You all have so many sports. I didn't play sports, so I'm not familiar, but everyone's so busy. And so we have to sort of plan around each child's needs. We're looking to send a concise testing portfolio to school so that Barry's happy. So we want to, we really want students to test. We don't want them to take it 7 times or something crazy, right? Most kids take it, 2 to 3 times. Certainly some kids take it once. We'll get to super scoring and mixing and matching, but we want your child to be ready when they take it. And we want them to be prepared, and they often do best on their second testing after they get out some of the nerves of the first testing. And again, we have kids test in the fall of their junior year. We have kids test in the spring of junior year. They tend to be a little tired, so it's the thing we think about. They certainly test in the summer preceding senior year, and they test into the fall of senior year. And so there's
My
no
favorite time.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm looking at the quick questions, then I'll go back to some of the details about sending scores and score choice and super scoring. One question is, can a student who took the paper SAT in the fall of 2023 super score with the digital SAT now? The schools haven't done this yet. Maybe Barry knows more than I do. I'm sure that they would be open to seeing scores from the SAT in the fall of 2023 and the spring of 2024. But I don't know how that's going to work, Barry. I don't know if you have something more to say about that.
Sure. So not surprisingly, the colleges really haven't said anything about it because they don't tend to be terribly student focused, if you haven't noticed that. And so they're thinking about the current seniors. They're not thinking about the juniors who are working to apply as they should be next year. So they haven't said anything. When I have spoken with admissions officers sort of on the, unofficially, they basically said, we're not sure. We think we might, because in the past they haven't. But the changes that have happened in the past is when it went from 2 sections to 3 sections and then back to 2 sections. Like it almost wasn't even an option. You could have ignored that 3rd section, I suppose, but they didn't feel it felt right to do that. So in this instance, in some ways, more of it is staying the same, even though the whole test is changing in some ways. So they really don't know. But they were saying that they were considering it. My guess is that it would just be a guess, so it's probably not worth sharing, but they haven't announced anything formal. I think what the best preparation is to assume that they will not, because if they don't, you don't want to suddenly say, oh my God, I had thought they would, and I was going to super score and thought I was done and I stopped or whatever. And then realize whether it's most schools or the school that you care about most is not going to do what you thought they were going to do. So prepare to either go fully digital or to submit fully paper. And if you get lucky, you might be able to super score from there. But they have not made any announcement. And the truth is I wouldn't expect it anytime soon, even though that is a disservice to current juniors.
And, to address what Barry's talking about, for anyone who's unfamiliar with this terminology of super scoring, period. Super scoring is the practice of mixing and matching multiple test dates to get a super score. So, for example, if you were to get an 800 on your math one day and a 740, good job, on your verbal, and then you switch them, a super score would give you 2 800s, right, on 2 different dates. Now, some schools will do that on the SAT and the ACT. Some will do it on the SAT. Some won't do it at all. Different schools have different policies. And as schools move more and more towards what we call self-reporting, again, not everyone does this, but many schools will allow you to report your scores on the Common Application. And then once you're admitted, you're going to formally send those scores. So certainly you're telling them the truth on your application. But when you're doing that sort of score, you're doing self-reporting on the ACT, you still have to report your best composite to date, even if your super scored composite is higher. So there are little ins and outs. And of course, Barry and I can talk about this individually with families, but and listen, our kids use super scoring, but it's not something we rely on. I always say, like, let's go for one great score, and certainly we may end up sending multiple scores. And if you do, they may see all the pieces. So one kid asked me the other day, do I even have to take the verbal if I got an 800? Like, can I just not take it? Can I just no, you have to take it. You have to do well on it. And chances are the schools are going to see the components as well. And will schools see it is in fact your super score? Yes, they'll see it's from different dates, right? So they will. And again, many honor that and are happy to have the super score, some on the SAT, some on both the ACT and the SAT. It depends on each school. So we don't like plan for super scoring, and then we ultimately often are using it. Barry, was there anything you wanted to add to the super scoring?
Yeah, I think one thing you want to be mindful of is, so when you self-report on the Common App, which, like Sasha said, most schools actually these days allow that, you're putting in your best single section score, including the date that corresponds to that score. So they'll see whether the 4 section scores of your ACT were gotten over 2 sittings versus 3 versus 4. And then you also put your single best composite. There is no place on the Common App for you to list your super score. So if a college super scores, they're doing it on our end, on their end. You're never putting it on your end, like, here's my best composite and here's my super score. And same with the SAT, they don't ask you to add them up there for whatever reason. But you're never reporting your super score. You're just reporting your highest section scores. In the SAT scenario, they're just adding them. Obviously, in the ACT, it's an average. So, but with regard to the super score, in terms of how many dates you're going to show, because to the question that was asked is, will they know? The more selective the school, the less you want to go beyond 2 dates. So 2 is fine. I don't care if it's 1 or 2, and it's almost always going to be 2. If it has to be 3, it'll be 3, but I prefer not. And so you want to try to get your super score in 2 sittings or 3 if needed, and that's it. And again, the more selective the school, the more, sort of attuned to things like that they might be. And I'm not saying it's like the make or break factor. I would pick a much higher score over 3 sittings than a lower score over 2 sittings any day. But you want to try, as Sasha said before, a condensed testing profile as best you can. Again, and I'm not shooting for 1. I mean like 2 or 3 if needed.
Great. And, I think one of the most important things as parents you can do to set your children up for success, and this is certainly for the juniors, but more for the 9th and 10th graders out there, is making sure that your child has the appropriate accommodations in place for these tests. If your child receives extra time or any other accommodations in school, if they have some needs that are happening in school that you're noticing in 8th grade, in 9th grade, that is the time to do neuropsych testing. That is the time, or you've already done it and you need to renew that. You need to do an updated one. When it comes time to apply for accommodations on these tests, the ACT or the SAT, maybe that's time and a half, maybe that's time and a half plus small groups. There's different accommodations, the most common of which is time and a half. And should your child be eligible for accommodations, your school actually is the one that applies for those accommodations. You submit information to them, and then they submit the application to the College Board or to the ACT. And certainly the earlier that process can happen, making sure you have up-to-date neuropsych or up-to-date pediatrician letters or whatever it is, making sure that your child is using those accommodations in school, because they will not be approved if they're not using those accommodations in school. setting them up, that's one of the things I always say to parents, that's what you can be doing in the background before your child may even be ready to prep. Yes, you need to technically register for a test to register for or to apply for accommodations. You don't need to take that test. Your child doesn't need to take that test, but having the appropriate accommodations ready for them when they start, and knowing if they're not going to get accommodations and whether or not you're going to appeal that or not is an important piece of this, because certainly I mentioned that difficult timing on the ACT, and if your child needs extra time, they need it in place on the ACT. So talking to your school about that, making sure you're talking to us about what needs to be in place, and the likelihood of being approved, and knowing that early. I have many kids who I've been like, we just have to wait. We have to wait. We need to know. I mean, there's no point prepping with one thing if we're going to have another thing, or if we're not going to have it. So,
Sasha, one thing
and
I wanted to add also, and then we should segue to some of the admissions stuff so that we have time, and then we can circle back because there'll be some testing that goes into that, is with regard to also when you test, when we were talking about a concise testing profile, is I don't really care when anyone else is testing. It's what's right for you. And there may be a kid who is ready in October of junior year because they're going to be one and done, or it's like their scores are starting out so high that it makes sense for them to start. But most people will get their better scores a little bit later. So you have to figure out who you are. And the goal is not to have you take this test. And Sasha, you may disagree with me, but I tend to find, as many times as is humanly possible in a short period of time, and assume at some point by sheer luck, it's going to hit on one of them. It should be a more deliberate and intentional sit down for the real test. So if you know you're not yet within striking distance of a usable score, don't go in. You can take full length practice tests with your tutor. You can do them on your own if you need to. There's no reason to go and log a true score and to go through that. And in theory, it sounds nice, but in practice, students don't tend to do well with logging poor scores and feeling like they have to dig back out of them. And so in theory, sure, go in each time, practice, more practice at the test. You'll be better on the day you really feel you're taking it. My experience is that students don't actually experience it that way, is that they go in, they do poorly for them as expected because they're just not ready yet. They're going to get there, but they're not there yet. And it really impacts their confidence and their psyche, which is so much a part of this test. And it's why seniors do better than spring semester juniors. They're the same kid. A lot of them don't do one lick of prep over the course of the summer, and then they come in and get a big pop because they're just calmer and like less stressed. So don't just think more is better. Just keep going and taking the test, or go in super early because your friend went in and is apparently done. That's great for them. It has no impact on you and your chances and your score and what will happen with your score when you submit it, if you do. So I would just say really keep it individualized with regard to when you take this test and how many times you actually take it. Forget about how many scores you ultimately submit, but even how many times you actually take a real true sit down SAT or ACT in like real conditions.
so important to tune out all those other kids. You don't know what their lives look like or why they're doing what they're doing. I completely agree, Barry. And we want your child to be poised for a confident test, and before we're going to transition to Barry in a moment, because there's so many questions about, is test optional? And I know she has stats for you. I just wanted to quickly put in one final thing, which is that I have so many parents call me and talk about test prep, but the grades are so important here. And I know we spend so much energy and time and money on these tests, and certainly they are often very useful or even expected. And Barry can talk about how they are positioned in the overall application. And certainly most of our students do want to send scores, and they send superb scores. But alongside those superb scores are superb grades, and are deep, interested, passionate kids who have worked hard on their extracurriculars. And I know we're going to talk all about the new SAT and digital and this and the ACT and accommodations, and I am here for all of that. And if the grades aren't in place, starting in really ninth grade, but certainly in throughout high school, if the child isn't healthy and well and doing all the things they care about, the scores are not going to get them where they need to be. So I just wanted to, I know people don't have as many questions about the schoolwork. It's a little more straightforward, but it is so important to this process. And I don't want it to be overlooked or overshadowed because of these tests. Obviously, I'm going to pass it on to Barry. Obviously, you may have many questions about your individual child, and you can always email me and we can talk more individually about your child's schedule and profile and what they should be doing. But Barry, our test's optional. That's the big question of the night. And then that'll give you a little, I think, segue into all things admissions.
It's the same answer that almost every admissions question would be responded with, which is it depends. I mean, yes, well, not at every school. There are some schools that do require it. It's a small number still, but I think two things can be true I know two things can be true at the same time. One is that relatively strong scores for a particular school can help you. At the same time, that not sending scores doesn't necessarily have to hurt you. And I think I have some numbers. I do have some stats to share. Not surprisingly, the percentage of submitters is not a statistic that a lot of schools are so quick to share. They do, often not until later in the spring. Many of them do not share that. It's a closely guarded secret still at this point. There's very little data out for the early rounds on that, but I do have some things to share. But the real truth is it depends on the school. And also for each individual candidate, whether or not you will be a strong candidate and a viable candidate and seen as a good fit with or without scores really is specific to the student. So I would say, if you had to speak very generally, that the more selective the school, the better off you would be if you can submit strong scores for that school. It doesn't mean that, oh, if I have scores to submit and I have good grades, I'm getting in, but it just gives them a little bit more to go on the academic front. And so it doesn't mean you can't get in without them, but I would say that in my experience that your chances go down the more selective the school, unless you are in a particular demographic where it might make sense for them to be a little bit more flexible. And with that said, I can also give you examples, very small number, but examples of students who fit no particular demographic of interest and got into Ivy League schools with no tests that are students, but it's a very small number. And I don't want to suggest that it's the norm. In each case, they were anomalies. They were strategic anomalies. We went for it in early to precisely because we felt that those were particular students who could potentially benefit. And we were lucky and they did, but it was a strategic call. It wasn't because that was the most likely outcome for 99% of the students who were in the same position. So you absolutely can do well in this process without scores, even at the higher level, if you're keyed into fit and if you can communicate that and in what you do and how you write it in your essays and speak in a compelling way to each individual school and compel them, to take that leap with you. But it is not the norm. I would say, generally speaking, if I had to give general advice out, you try for those tests, you do the very best that you can with the hope that you'll be able to submit scores. Because then you don't have to think at all, like, will the scores not being there potentially hamper my chances or lessen my chances? If the scores are there, we just know they're a non-issue. And what we always know about scores is that when you submit them and they're good for that school, it's not what gets you in. We just know it's not going to be what keeps you out. And so that's all we're going for, is that we can just clear that bar, the testing bar, easily and swiftly and move past it. And then let them get to your essays. And we know that their essays are going to be great and that that's where we are going to shine the brightest. And so we want them to get there as quickly as possible and give them no reason to pause before. So I think it's helpful as we talk about admissions and as we transition to admissions. I do think that data can be really helpful. Sometimes I'm often like, forget about the numbers. It really matters, like individual students, and it does. Everybody's an individual. And I often will say, I don't care what the data says for you. This is the better choice, and you have an easier chance to get into this school. At the same time, you need to couch your strategy and your sense of this process in general data and numbers. And so I do want to share some with you. And here we have, you can see that these are from, there's not much data out, by the way. Schools were quieter than usual in this fall ED round, not surprisingly, in my opinion, given the court case last spring. But we did get some data and we pull all of it that we can, but you can see here just when we look at application numbers, because that's always going to be a driving factor of admit rates, that generally speaking, these schools that are listed here all went up, and most of them by, or some of them by pretty sizable percentages, with two notable exceptions, Brown going down by almost 8%, and Harvard, as has been reported widely in the news, down 17% in early. So, what are the reasons for that? Anybody can guess. We don't know exactly, and we'll also see with regular decision numbers if they make up for that, and what the final numbers look like. But it's interesting even to see the shift just year to year. This is just from last year to this fall for early decision only at these particular schools. But I mean, Dartmouth having almost an 18% increase just in early is pretty spectacular in terms of numbers. Duke's number of 28% is scary looking, but their dean says that he believes that a lot of that bulk is to do with the new financial aid policy that they have for North Carolina residents. I'm not sure, he didn't then share numbers of what percentage of the pool were those students, but that's what he has shared. But nonetheless, I don't think it accounts for probably all of it by any stretch. But you can kind of see sort of where things are. Another thing I think is sort of helpful is just then the admit rates, right, which is what people are generally interested in. You can see, so these groups at the top, that group of Yale, Dartmouth, Duke, Williams, MIT, are all where the admit rate went down last year to this year, usually by a relatively small amount, all things considered. And then the three that we have at the bottom, where admit rates went up. Brown, which was one of the schools we saw with their application numbers going down, not surprisingly, we see a little bit of a boost in their admit rate as well. And Harvard also had a small bump. It was small, but it was a slightly higher admit rate this fall than last fall. But I have some numbers for you coming up where you'll see what percentage of their pool is deferred. And that will give you a little bit of a chuckle in a couple of moments. But Boston College and BU also up slightly in terms of admit rates for this fall. Another bit of data, this is where you can kind of see, I was just mentioning that we can smirk a little bit together. I pulled, again, we have very limited data right now, and just trying to give you a little bit of a snapshot of what has happened this year. You'll see that we have a pretty different approaches to admissions, as you can see. And I know that, by the way, we're seeing all highly selective schools in these slides. They tend to be the places that release the most data, because the most eyeballs are on them in the media and otherwise. And so I'm not doing it because I expect that these are the only types of schools that students are applying to, or because the only schools that students we work with apply to, but just because this is what we have at this time. But you can see that Harvard defers 83% of their early applicants. So when you get deferred by Harvard, what does that mean? Should you hang on tight because there's a likely chance, or is this likely to end up, a defer to a deny situation? Whereas Brown is looking at about 68% of students denied. Yale also, 70% of students denied. In my opinion, this is the way it should be. If you know there's no chance that you are taking this applicant in the spring, cut them loose so they can strategize for themselves and not hang on. There are plenty of students who won't do ED2 somewhere because they feel like, you know what, I was deferred, I've got to see it through at my ED1 school. If you knew, and often they do know, that they're not going to take you. When I was in admissions, we had students, we just literally wrote defer to deny. And when you came up in the spring, we just denied you. We thought it was an easier way to let students down and to let high schools down, but it's a disservice to students. And so you're seeing some shifts. It's only been in the last 2-ish years that Yale and Brown have shifted to this larger denial pool. And I appreciate it, not because I want so many students, of course, to get to denied, but it does help you refocus your strategy or even just your perspective. Even if there is no ED2 school, you can move on faster psychologically and mentally and start maybe getting excited about some of the other schools. But you can see there's a really it's a different approach. Williams also denying over half the pool, which again, I appreciate, but you can see that there's just wildly different approaches by schools that many people think of as overlaps with regard to how they handle their early applicants. The good news is that if you get deferred at Brown, it actually means something, and that you might actually have a chance and you're going to get a really good look afterwards. But this is helpful. And then one last piece of data that I think is helpful to share, and this goes back to Sasha's, what Sasha was talking about, very, very little, again, from early schools at this point, but you can see that 75% of, these are admits, by the way, not applicants, but admits, 75% of Dartmouth admits submitted testing, ding, 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 pay attention to that number. Over half, 61% of Emory admits in ED1 submitted testing. I would say that that is a strong indication that ideally you would be submitting testing. You see a lower number at BU, 35%. That's encouraging for students, certainly. And last year, I didn't see it for this year. Last year at Duke, it was something like 60-something percent, 67% or something like that, submitters versus non-submitters. I did not share that information yet this year. I don't know if it's approximately the same or will be different, but you can kind of see the lower the admit rate, it seems like, at least for the ones that we know of, you see a higher percentage of submitters. So, I just think that all of these things are instructive. They help, I think, sort of orient people sort of to what the landscape is, but it will always, always, always be individualized. There are so many students who have a better chance, like a better percentage chance of getting into a particular school that may be harder to get into, have a lower overall admit rate than another school that they may be applying to. But if you're such a good fit and you can communicate that appropriately through your essays and your profile and what you do and how it all comes together, you will have a better chance at a school regardless of what the admit rate is. And so again, I share these general statistics because I do think they're instructive and they're helpful, but every single thing will come down to the individual student. And it's not only, what you're doing and why you do it and how it comes together. It always will be in the execution with how you communicate that in the writing. And one thing that we've seen is so we saw differences in essay questions post-pandemic. That was sort of the first big push in a lot of changes in essay questions. And then, not surprisingly, after the court decision last spring, we've seen changes to existing essay questions with different wording. And we've also seen more so in the more selective schools, just addition, like more essays, adding of essays. And so as if the supplements weren't already long enough and you didn't already have to write so many essays, now there are more of them. But what's fascinating is that if you look at the new essays or the revised essay questions, particularly ones that related to identity, they actually lift language directly from the court decision. And that's why they also kind of sound the same. But there's literal exact language. And we had said it on an earlier webinar. I had said, I expect that lawyers, not admissions officers, would be writing this year's admissions questions. And then when they actually came out and you could see that it literally same language, it really was clear that the lawyers wrote the prompts this year. And admissions probably just said, okay, that makes sense. This is what we're trying to get at. Thank you for approving it. We're going to move forward. And so we see a lot of overlap in language and the kinds of questions that colleges are asking, making it even more incumbent upon the student to be able to speak individually to each school differently according to their vibe and what we know their biases are and the kinds of students that they tend to find more or less compelling. I think people got a little bit excited about the similar language and saying, oh my God, I got the same essay across schools. I can kind of just, copy and paste and change the name of a class and a professor and an activity. Nothing could be further from the truth. It actually puts more of a burden on the student to make sure that their essay and their voice and their language is distinctive to the individual institution. And so that's been a challenge, and it's been fun, and it's been interesting. And it's made students have to dig a little bit deeper to do so. But I think students come up with better lists when they're pushed, actually. And so it will be interesting to see. But the good news is that in this early round, there really truly were no surprises for us. And so that's a good sign that the things that are core and at the center of what we know to be the admissions process are still intact, and that doing it at a certain level will still help you clear the bar, regardless of kind of the changes and the shifts that are happening underneath. And so that was at least good. And even when we saw, for instance, Cornell announced that they were taking fewer students in early this year because they wanted to give time for more students who couldn't get an early application together, we saw the highest percentage of admits to Cornell. And so even when it seems like, or it definitely is getting tougher, we're still seeing that the way that we approach it and the way that we're thinking about things, that again, the core things are still in place in the admissions process. And I think that should give everybody some sense of, I don't want to say relief, but at least some bit of confidence that the control that you do have over your application and the choices that you ultimately have are there, as long as you can, again, effectively communicate to each school individually.
I think I caught Barry saying something was fun in this, and she's in the right line of work because she does, I think,
It's
find
not
it.
just me, actually. Our students, after several of them will say that was actually fun, or that was actually more fun than I thought. And that's actually the best compliment. It doesn't mean it's not challenging, and it doesn't mean it's not stressful at times, but I think if you're doing it right, you actually learn a lot about yourself. And our experience is that kids are pretty cool when you get to know them. And so I think people start seeing connections and things about themselves that, to maybe an outsider like us, or, somebody who knows you but hasn't been with you the whole way through in your life, are pretty obvious to us, or things that we see that they've never thought about. And when they realize that, it's like, oh, things start making a little bit more sense, and things start coming together, and people feel better about themselves, not worse. And I think a lot of people associate this process with maybe the opposite. But again, I think if you're doing it right, it actually plays a lot of different roles, and you can be successful in the process at the same time.
I feel the same way about the test, right? I mean, the tests are difficult, but the best compliment we get is when the child says you, or it's really not me, but the tutors expanded my sense of what I could do. I didn't think I was this kind of person. I was not a math kid. I was not a tester, and I learned my capacity. And I think that's such a gift, and man, they are cool. So I agree with that. I see a couple questions, and they're sort of related, and maybe Barry can take parts of them and I can take other parts. One is about the APs, and then that's also connected to the question about applying to universities abroad. So for the AP exams, advanced placement exams, we're seeing, especially the sort of most elite high schools, not all, boarding schools are still there, whatever, but a lot of them are moving away from giving AP courses. Nothing to be alarmed by. If your school is giving rigorous courses, it doesn't need to be an AP course. Some schools still give AP courses. If your child is taking an AP course, the AP exam is the thing that happens at the end of it. It's kind of like the period at the end of the sentence, and certainly sending a great score is a nice period at the end of the sentence. None of the schools in the US, we're going to get to the UK in a moment, it's like the opposite, but none of the schools require AP exams as part of this application. So if there's easy 5s out of 5, why they could never all be on the same thing. So these ones are out of 5. If you have that 4, those 5s, you're sending them absolutely. If you're taking an AP course, they might even earn you college credit or get you out of an annoying requirement once you get to college. It's nice to come into college with some credits. It's certainly nice to have the period at the end of the sentence, but the A in your AP history class is more important than that 5 on the test, because it's not a requirement for admissions the way the SAT or ACT is at Georgetown.
Can I just add one thing, Sasha, just as clarification? They absolutely are not necessarily required. However, if you're taking an AP class and you're applying to a selective or highly selective college, you would be very best served submitting a score
And if
Now,
you're
again, depending what the score is, we would withhold a score if it was a 3 or lower for sure, and you're applying to a highly selective school, but it depends, well, what other scores do you have? How many are we leaving out? How many are 5s versus 4s? Like even sometimes, so there's, again, it depends. But I would say I wouldn't be as flip about just sort of like, oh, they're not required. If you want to send them, send them. If you don't want to send them, don't send them. I think you need to be more thoughtful and strategic depending on the individual school and what your testing profile is going to be, not just for putting aside SAT, ACT, I mean, with your APs. One thing that comes up for students, for those of you in the audience who go to New York City private schools in particular, are kids who take AP exams, even though there are no AP classes offered, or they're not taking the AP. And to that, I could care less about submitting an extra AP exam for something like for a class that you didn't take. And by the way, most of the kids who will take those tests are not surprisingly doing well in their course and are good test takers. So it just gives you more data that we already have, more test scores that are strong or something that correlates to the A that they're getting in the class. And so I don't see like a need or any extra benefit to doing that. And often just tell students to skip it, even though other kids are doing it in their school and they're just fine. So I wouldn't feel pressured to take AP exams when you're not taking an AP course, regardless of what schools you're applying to. Unless every once in a
some of
blue
those
moon.
UK. Oh,
Oh,
sorry, go
no, I'm
ahead.
talking about US, sorry, US schools,
US
sorry.
schools. Yeah.
Purely US colleges and universities, yes, as a clarification. Every once in a blue moon, and it really is like a true anomaly. There may be some reason in some very unusual case where taking an AP exam might make some sense, but that would be so specific to somebody that I wouldn't give it as, general advice. But absolutely, Sasha, and you can talk about the UK and other testing requirements for schools abroad, which very much focus on these tests.
Yeah, and as we see our New York City kids, again, the boarding schools are a little different, and there are still New York City schools who have AP classes. Again, that's the period at the end of the sentence. If it's not there, it's missing, right? Like, where is it? But for those kids who are not in AP courses, which is more and more common for my kids, not ubiquitous by any means, but more and more common, we don't need to just like add things to the application if it's going, and certainly not at the expense of the grades or other things. Certainly Oxford, Cambridge, some of the UK schools, they require AP scores of 5s, and they require a certain amount of them. It can be, I think off the top of my head, it's like 5 or something for Oxford or 4 for Cambridge. So unfortunately, if you're applying to both some of the top UK schools and the US schools, whether or not your child's in AP classes, they do need to sit for those exams, and they do need to earn a certain level. And actually, the UK schools are very specific about in which fields they need to be testing. And it's not just take any, it's like you're going to be applying to the government school or, the engine, math and science, whatever it is. And you need to take the calculus and a science one and things like that. So it gets pretty tricky with the UK schools. As far as I know, schools like McGill and other schools in Canada, it's SAT or ACT. So that just, the APs are sort of this gray area. It's so dependent on where you go to high school, whether or not you are taking those exams and whether or not you need to take those exams, and then also where you're applying, if you are applying just to schools in the US versus applying abroad. So that, and then maybe the final, we're running out of time, but Barry, there's a question about the child's grade trajectory, right? Does a child, and do schools know how difficult your child's curriculum is, right? Certainly, just like we talked about on the SAT, it's not just the how, if you got it right. So maybe you can speak to, do they care about those 9th grade grades, and who can, and what about the competitiveness of your child's school?
Yeah, so it's a good question. And I think, again, this is something where sort of two things can be true at one time. So we would always, if things aren't going to be consistent throughout, we'd always prefer an upward trajectory than a downward trajectory, of course. And will admissions officers notice that? Of course. Will they take note of it? Of course. Will it be enough to still clear the bar? Not always. It depends on where you're applying. I think when you think about let's say more competitive or selective high schools, places that are known to be more rigorous, let's say, places that people say, well, a B here is like an A at the school down the street, and that kind of stuff. Okay, but people are getting A's in that school, in that more rigorous school, and plenty of kids are getting A's, and those are going to be the kids that the more selective schools are going to take. And so, yes, it is the case, perhaps, and maybe not. Sometimes people say it and it's not necessarily true, but it makes them feel better. But let's just even say that, yes, it's the approximately equivalent. A B here is like an A somewhere else. Well, maybe then you have to rethink about where you are in school, right? I'm not saying for people should transfer high schools in the middle, but I think you have to remember you're at your school. They're going to evaluate you in the context of your school. They're not going to compare you to kids at another school, whether you think it's a better school than yours or not as good a school as yours. They can only compare you within the context of your high school, because no two high schools are alike, even if you take schools that you actually think are sort of peer institutions or equivalent in some way. And so people will often ask me, well, there are these B's, but the course was so hard. It's the hardest class at the school, or it is just so hard to get an A. So the few B's and they're just in ninth grade. Yes, but again, the more selective the school, when a place is admitting 3% of students, they just have to be nitpickier, or they are nitpickier. And so those kinds of things can make a difference. It does not mean that you have to have all A's from start to finish to have a chance at a highly selective school. But if you don't, it is sort of something that we think of, okay, well, there's this B in ninth grade. And is it just that there's a B in ninth grade, or is it that there are 5 B's between ninth and 11th grade? Those are two very different scenarios. Even if you have a B in 10th grade, even B plus, B pluses versus A minus. I mean, there's so many pieces. So sort of two things. One, ideally as many A's, A minuses as possible. But that's not going to be the reality for most people, even with the ridiculous grade inflation that we have, even more so post-pandemic. And if you have a relative, like a small, like a B here or there, and you're shooting super high, like don't fret. But when you start having multiple B's, even if there's an upward trajectory, it will be harder to get into, of course, the most selective schools, but people should be looking and are looking all over the place. And it doesn't mean that you can't get into a selective school, or even what we would consider to be a highly selective school. There's a wide band of those as well, and you only need one. And so if you have the right fit and you can nail it, you can get into potentially, the one that you need. You can only go to one in the fall. And so while it's nice to have a lot of options, if you can hit it in one place that's really important to you, success. And so I think it's just so individualized, but I don't want to overstate like, oh yeah, if it's an upward trajectory, who cares about those ninth grade grades? It's just not the case that they're going to just ignore them. The same way Sasha was alluding to earlier, where if you have these super high test scores, but the grades are low, they're not going to say, well, then forget about the grades because the test scores are high. And so it doesn't matter. And the reverse too, right? High grades in rigorous courses, and then you've got a lower test score, you'd be better off not submitting it. And so in that instance, you have the option, of course, not to show it, whereas the grades have to be shown. And so I think that there is something to be said for an upward trajectory, but you don't want to overplay that hand or overstate it. And then also I would say, just as a final point, that I would argue that 12th grade grades are the most important, mostly when they go down, if they go down even a little bit. And so you want to try to really keep those 12th grade grades up as best you can. Don't give up don't give up in senioritis. Don't give up after you're like exhausted in 11th grade and feel like, we can mop the floor with you. Relax and rest over the summer and be recharged and ready to go for the first part of senior year.
And in terms of the rigor of your school, I mean, again, yes, the rigor of your classes are very important. Within the context of your school, your counselors will be expressing that you took the most rigorous courses available to you. So certainly taking those advanced classes, whether or not they're AP, and doing well in them are important. But that's not the same as saying my whole school's hard. So, I can have lower grades. I know that we have to wrap up. It's 7 o'clock, and I've got a toddler to feed, but you know, it's such a pleasure, Barry, to listen to you. I could listen to you talk about this stuff all the time, and I loved looking at those stats. They did make me chuckle. So it's always nice to have a laugh in the midst of this kind of stressful stuff. And of course, yeah, exactly. And of course, individual students, each child, I mean, we take so much time with each child. So, you know, those individual questions y'all have, we're here to talk to you individually and work with you individually on them.
Yeah, thank you so much. Also, always changing with the testing, got to keep us on our toes. And all the juniors, you know, are impacted by that. And certainly the younger kids behind them who will be kind of the first full year taking a digital SAT should they choose to do so. So we're here to help navigate everything through the changes and through the things also that stay consistent over time. Thankfully, there are some of those things too. And we wish everyone the best of luck. And if you have any questions or need to reach out, you know where to reach us. So thank you so much and have a good night, everybody.
Everyone.